Thank you very much, Madam Speaker. I rise to speak on the emergency debate on the Trans Mountain Pipeline. Glad we're having the opportunity to speak about this. I've got to tell you, I hear about this issue more than any other from constituents in Calgary-Elbow and from Albertans that I talk with around the province. When I go door knocking, there is frustration, there is concern, there is absolute anger that we find ourselves in a situation where Alberta has some of the most responsibly produced oil in the entire world, but we can't sell it. We can't get it off of out of the province, and we can't ship it. And I've been talking with people who are part of the investment community in the energy sector. And they've said that, things were really looking up. There was a belief that this pipeline was going to go ahead, that they could rely on the regulatory process, they could rely on the federal and provincial governments to actually ensure that the process was followed, that we'd actually see a pipeline built. And they were starting to see capital maybe start to move back into Alberta, but this has frozen everything. Not just investments related to oil and gas exploration and production, but investments related to technology. Investments that are totally unrelated to the oil and gas sector, but investors from around the world are looking at what's happening in Canada and they're saying, I'm not sure I can trust putting my money there. I feel like maybe there's more risk in Canada than I thought, and so I'm going to pull back and wait and see if Canada can figure itself out. And so what used to be a massive advantage for Canada, political stability, a predictable regulatory regime. In fact, we have such a great reputation around the world, or I should say we had such a great reputation around the world, that our regulatory experts would help set up regulatory regimes in other parts of the world. Well, that's no longer true. We are now seen as a very risky place to do business, and that is really a tragedy. It costs Albertans jobs. It costs Albertan families. It costs tax dollars that could go into important programs in health and education and ensure our society is a fairer place. And so it's not just a straight fiscal issue whether or not we ensure that our pipelines or our product gets sold to the rest of the world. So when I look at the approach that the NDP have taken, they said, Albertans, if we have a carbon tax, we are going to get a pipeline. They just made a straight equivalence. Carbon tax equals pipeline. Well, no pipeline. What does that mean for the carbon tax? Is it a straight equation now, or are we now going on some other plan? So where we've ended up, though, is instead of having a pipeline, and instead of quietly going about their work of ensuring the regulatory process was followed, what the government's done is govern to a headline. They've just said carbon tax equals pipeline, and the moment that the federal government purchased the Kinder Morgan pipeline, what did they do? They took a victory lap. They may have well strung up a banner in front of the Legislative Assembly that said mission accomplished. They trotted out all of their caucus, and the Premier did a big news conference, and a number of us on the opposition side, staff and media, were kind of standing around gobsmacked watching this spectacle. And now all of a sudden, well, the courts decide that the regulatory process was not followed, that in fact Indigenous people were not appropriately consulted. Now, I've talked to some lawyers, and I think there's some disagreement as to whether or not that is in fact a correct ruling and that perhaps the federal government should look at appeal. But regardless, that is the responsibility of the federal government to consult at phase 3 with Indigenous people and do a consultation that is a proper two-way consultation. That is on the federal government. But where I hold the provincial government accountable is you can't tell me that within the Ministry of Energy or within the private sector in this province that we don't have a few regulatory experts, lawyers, regulatory experts, who could perhaps look over the shoulder of the federal government and make sure that that process is followed. But that didn't happen. The province of Alberta was completely hands-off back in 2016 and just said, well, we'll just trust Ottawa. When has it ever worked in the province of Alberta where we sit back and say, well, we'll just trust Ottawa, things will be fine? Well, clearly not. And so it is not just Ottawa's fault that this happened. It is absolutely on the provincial government, who should have been looking over the shoulder, who should have been bringing some of that regulatory expertise to bear in that process to make sure that the Trans Mountain Pipeline went ahead. The tragedy of this is compounded by the fact that not only is this an economic story, as I said before, but it's an environmental story too. The research and innovation that's happening in this province, in fact, we had an opportunity with my Alberta Party caucus colleagues this morning to tour the University of Alberta. And there's unbelievable work going on underway at the University of Alberta on carbon abatement, on reducing land use for resource development and development of all kinds, on reducing the use of fresh water, on abating tailings ponds and oil sands. These are the problems that not just Alberta is grappling with, but the world is grappling with. And I have always maintained that Alberta's contribution to fighting climate change is, yes, reducing our emissions here at home, but the far greater contribution that we will make to fighting climate change is developing technologies in Alberta that will address carbon emissions that we can then sell to the rest of the world. That is our contribution, and that contribution is funded directly by ensuring that Alberta oil and gas gets to market. So when pipelines are delayed or deferred or perhaps even cancelled, it has a massive impact on the environmental side. It has a devastating and negative impact on carbon emissions globally. That is a case that I don't believe the NDP have made nearly strong enough to our friends in British Columbia, nor to the rest of Canada. Building pipelines is a pro-environmental policy, and not just having a carbon tax in Alberta. Building pipelines enables research and development that will reduce global carbon emissions. That's the goal. That case has not been made nearly strongly enough. The other consequences, of course, are more oil on rail. So that is, we know, statistically more risky. I don't want to suggest for a moment it's unsafe, but it's not as safe in any way as shipping oil through pipelines. We know that. That costs more, which has an impact on the bottom line for energy companies, which means they hire fewer people, which means they generate fewer taxes, they pay lower royalties. It has a substantial economic cost. And it also presents barriers to other Alberta products, agricultural products in particular, finding their way to market. It enriches the train companies. I'm sure they're thrilled with it, but it's not anywhere near the best interests of Albertans. Now, the Minister of Environment and others have talked about Bill C-69 and that simply does not work for Alberta. I agree. There are substantial problems with Bill C-69. I will say that the current rules, SIA 2012, also don't work for Alberta. There's many examples of that in the energy industry. On another project that's currently underway, a project that's very close to my heart and the interest of the constituents of not just Calgary-Elbow, but downtown Calgary, the Springbank Off-Stream Reservoir, a very, very important project, and the goalposts continually move on that project. Every time there's a filing, a huge amount of questions come back, and the timeline moves back, and the timeline moves back, and it just never seems to end. And that's a challenge that I can understand now, having intimately and closely watched this process. I can only imagine for a project that's frankly relatively simple like the SR1 project, compared to a massively complex project like a pipeline or a tailings pond or an oil sands development. I can't imagine how much effort and time and cost would go into that. So, Madam Speaker, I stand here frustrated that we don't have a clear path forward on the pipeline, that it is not under construction as this government said it would. But, of course, here in the Alberta Party caucus, we are always cheering for pipelines. We will never cheer against Alberta. We will never cheer for a project to fail. We want this project to succeed, and we want it to go ahead very, very quickly. But Albertans are demanding a credible plan for energy, not just pipelines. They're demanding a credible plan for energy diversification, for petrochemical, for upgrading, for expanding exploration and production, for opening up investment once again in Alberta, and not seeing those dollars that are going to energy development in the United States. It's far easier to get projects approved in the U.S. than it is here. So it doesn't mean that we need to abandon our responsibility, environmental responsibility, social responsibility, safety. Those are things that we do better in this province and in this country than anywhere in the world, and we ought to be proud of that. But companies, investors need some certainty that the money they put in is going to result in project approvals and reviews in a timely way. And so, since a credible plan isn't forthcoming from this government, I can promise you that the Alberta Party will present a credible plan going into the next election for how we get Alberta's energy sector back up and running and how we get Albertans back to work, and most importantly, how we get pipelines built. Thank you, Madam Speaker.